Hi, I'm Megan Jennings. I'm a research ecologist at San Diego State University and co-director of the Institute for Ecological Monitoring and Management here at SDSU. I'm also one of the lead investigators for the Connecting Wildlands and Communities project. I'm excited to have you join me today so I can tell you a bit about that project and what we have planned, and also really looking forward to getting your feedback. We have an online feedback form hosted at the Climate Science Alliance webpage that you'll have an opportunity to fill out as we go along. I'll be giving you some opportunities to pause the recording, fill out the feedback form, and tell us what you think about the different aspects of the project as I describe them. The Connecting Wildlands and Communities project is funded by a grant from the California Strategic Growth Council through the California Climate Investments Program. Our research team is based out of San Diego State University, working in partnership with the Climate Science Alliance and the Scripps Center for Climate Change Impacts and Adaptation. The goal of this work is really to provide science in service of planning for climate-ready landscapes using a multiple benefit approach to climate adaptation and conservation. And conservation is really how this project came about. Our initial vision for this project started with work that we've been doing on conservation planning across the South Coast ecoregion, the area outlined in yellow that you see on the map. Within this region, there's diverse land ownership, represented by the different colors on the map, and it's a biodiversity hotspot. However, in the midst of all this is also one of the largest metropolitan areas in the country. So although there's a lot of land conserved, making sure that these areas are connected for ecological functioning, wildlife movement, and preservation of biodiversity is an important conservation goal. So, over the last 2.5 years, we've been working to develop a strategy to ensure the habitats within these conserved lands, like you see pictured on the screen, as well as future acquisitions, can be connected with our Climate Resilient Connectivity Project, which has been funded by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Wildlife Conservation Board. Through this work, we're developing a prioritized linkage strategy for the region that will allow for resilience and adaptation of our natural systems under climate change and land use change. So on the maps, you can see a prioritization ranging from low in red to high in green for 5 of the species that we've modeled. So it's things like relatively common species, bobcat in the upper left-hand corner and western toad in the upper right-hand corner. And as we've worked on this project, we found that there were additional challenges that we're concerned about with the future of climate and land use change for managing resilient natural landscapes. And that's really how we began to develop the idea for the Connecting Wildlands and Communities project. These issues are related to fire, water, and land use changes, but they aren't just challenges for our natural systems, they're also challenges for our human communities. So you can begin to see how we would start to think about connecting the wildlands and human communities. So we developed the Connecting Wildlands and Communities project to address these issues for both natural landscapes and human communities in the region. So we're taking a watershed approach where we'll focus on a subset of the watersheds that you see pictured on the map. And one of the things that I want to stress is that much of our focus will be about the wildland-urban interface. So the areas up against natural lands where we have rural communities, and building resilience for both those rural communities as well as the adjacent natural lands, where we have that intersection, being able to come up with benefits for both rather than having to make decisions about either one. And also the watershed-based approach will have implications for urban and coastal areas, even though that might not be the primary focus of some of our research outputs. So really we'll be integrating some of that, but it won't be our primary focus. Now, as I mentioned, the threats that our human communities face are also threats to our native ecosystems. So for example, from the wildfire perspective, we're already experiencing more frequent fire than our ecosystems are adapted to. That's represented in yellow to red. So we're much more frequent than we used to be when we get to the red colors. And that increased fire frequency increases fire risk to humans by threatening life and property, and it can also lead to vegetation type conversion in wildlands, threatening native species and their habitats. In thinking about water, we're already a water-limited system in Southern California and across much of California, where we have low probabilities of flow across much of the region, streams represented with light blue, and few areas that regularly flow, areas in the darker blue. The changes in hydrologic flows can be challenging to manage in such an arid region like Southern California, which already experiences high variability in precipitation. We'll continue to experience more frequent and severe droughts like we have over the last few years under climate change, and that'll be punctuated by more severe storms that may disrupt ecosystems and human communities. So we want to be thinking about how to benefit both the human and natural communities by being more strategic about water planning and planning for natural lands to conserve water. And then finally, all of this exists within an area that's continuing to grow, and land use change and expanding urbanization, urban is the areas on the map in gray, into areas of natural lands in green. So we'll see an expansion of these urban areas over time, and that's likely to exacerbate some of the issues that I've been talking about related to wildfire, water, and natural lands conservation if they aren't planned for in a strategic approach. So our hope is to provide data in service of that. And then through all of this, there's the planning context that we hope to provide information to serve. So that can be a range of things from regional to local to conservation planning. So from the regional level, things like regional transportation plans and sustainable community strategy updates, hazard mitigation and disaster planning, drilling down into general plan updates, climate action planning, and climate adaptation planning at more local jurisdiction levels, natural community conservation planning and habitat conservation planning for natural lands, and implementation of all of the above. And this is not an all-inclusive list. We'll be asking for your input as we move on additional planning context or planning efforts that you may want to see incorporated. And the stakeholder engagement and input part of this project is critical to the success of what we're doing and the entire design. And it's why we've started the project by asking for your feedback, and we'll continue to do so as we go throughout, both sharing with you the research that we're developing as we go along and also asking for your input at regular intervals. And the goal of this stakeholder engagement is to identify, at least at this stage, is to identify the research questions and outputs that will be most informative in guiding planning for climate resilient wildlands and human communities. Regardless of what background and perspective you're coming at this from, we want to hear what would be most informative to the work that you do and how you do it. Fortunately, we already have a good start on stakeholder engagement with a diverse group of folks that are helping us take an interdisciplinary and broad-based approach. We have folks ranging from business, industry, and consulting to different levels of government, federal, state, and local, many nonprofits interested in the work that we're doing, as well as tribal members and community members interested in this project. And we're excited because we want to hear from you, and we hope to serve these different stakeholders throughout this process. But we also need your help to continue to spread the word. So please do let folks know who you think may benefit from this or have information to share with us, that we are looking for engagement and looking for feedback from stakeholders who have knowledge, information, and interest in this project. So the first phase of this feedback has been through the in-person workshops, but if you're joining me on the video, you may not have been able to attend, and we'd like to hear from you on our online feedback forum. So you may want to pause the video at this point and go to the online feedback forum hosted on the Climate Science Alliance webpage, pull it up, and then I'll offer you opportunities to pause along the way as I introduce each of the focal topics, and you can register your feedback as we go along. So for each topic, I'm going to tell you a bit about the research outputs we're planning to focus on that will provide data and information in support of planning for, first, wildland benefits and resilience, and then second, human community benefits and resilience. There will absolutely be some overlap between these two categories, and we'll be looking for opportunities to integrate them and to make it truly a multi-benefit and multidisciplinary approach. But we decided to start out this way to sort of categorize things separately. We'll be looking for your feedback on other data and information that would be helpful to your work and planning efforts that we haven't already mentioned as we go along. So we'll start off with the wildfire topic. Our research team for the fire focal area will be Doug Stowe from the SDSU Geography Department, as well as Manny Story. And then we're also fortunate to have Alex Seifert from the Conservation Biology Institute and SAGE underwriters joining us, as well as Aaron Conlisk from Point Blue Conservation Science. So for wildfire, some of the data outputs or informational outputs that we're interested in developing are historic post-fire recovery and vegetation change, vegetation recovery in future climate and fire scenarios, the role of landscape configuration and habitat connectivity in controlling fire behavior and hazard, and the implications of frequent fire on carbon sequestration and water, how sequestration values or water availability change immediately after a fire and in the post-fire recovery environment. For the human community benefits, we're interested in understanding the change in fire risk to structures associated with vegetation change in Santa Ana wind zones, and the spatial information and management approaches for low-income communities at risk of fire, and how to better mitigate that risk. So you may want to pause here and visit the feedback form for the wildfire focal area. Our water research team is led by Alicia Kinoshita in our environmental engineering department, along with Jack Mikesell. For the wildland benefits and resilience, they'll be focusing on water quality and quantity assessment. And the nice thing about what they'll be doing for this is that the information will be developed at multiple scales. For some pieces of information, we can drill down really fine scale. And for other things, we can make assessments of different information across the entire landscape. So there's a lot of flexibility in the modeling that'll be done. The risks to watersheds from increased wildfires, target areas for restoration and management, resilience to climate and land use or land cover variability, and healthy and sustainable watersheds for habitat. For human community benefits and resilience, we'll be focusing on flood and sedimentation hazard mitigation, in particular in a post-fire environment, watershed services, things like clean water and water supply, as well as recreational benefits. Again, you may want to pause here, fill out the feedback form on the water topic area. For biodiversity and conserved lands, Becca Lewison and I from the San Diego State Biology Department will be heading that up with assistance from Aaron Conlisk, mentioned before, who has been our collaborator on the Climate Resilient Connectivity Project. And as I mentioned, for this top focal area, we have that Climate Resilient Connectivity Project as really a baseline of information that we will continue to build off of under this project with the focus on biodiversity and conserved lands. So for wildland benefits and resilience, one of the first things we're interested in doing is assessing the connectivity of that value across the landscape for other species. I mentioned a few that we have currently modeled connectivity for, but that doesn't really tell us how well those corridors will function for other species, in particular threatened and endangered species. So I'm calling those at-risk species, or perhaps rare species that are found nowhere else. How well does the linkage design that we've developed and prioritized through the prior project serve those other species, and do we need to add things in for them to make it functional for a wider range of species, in particular those that we're most concerned about? Climate refugia for droughts and increased temperatures to make sure that the linkages and core areas that we've identified in our Climate Resilient Connectivity Project will function for providing enough water under drought situations or cooler temperature under increased temperatures. And how resilient are those climate refugia? How well do they serve under changing conditions? The risk to connected lands from increased wildfires, in particular the vegetation type conversion that I mentioned that can convert shrublands to grasslands and really change the habitat value for wildlife and plants. And then finally, incorporating all this additional information into the target areas for acquisition or restoration that we're already developing from the Climate Resilient Connectivity Project. For the human community benefits and resilience, one of the things we want to do is assess the value of connected conserved lands for carbon sequestration. From many of our partners and stakeholders, we've been hearing that coming up with a quantitative value for carbon sequestration value in our natural landscapes, particularly in shrubland ecosystems, is something that is very important, but has been difficult to assess and widely apply. And so we hope to try and help address some of those concerns and provide a quantitative metric. Thinking about ecosystem services, things like clean air and water, how natural lands provide quality of life through things like recreational opportunities, and hazard mitigation, how conserving lands may help with reducing fire risk or flood risk, for example. Finally, we have our planning frameworks. This team is being led by Sherry Ryan at the San Diego State University Department of City Planning, with assistance from Diane Foote, who's also our project manager. For wildland benefits and resilience, we'll be developing some decision support tools that will incorporate ecological connectivity, wildfire risk, and water sustainability, really the intersection of these three focal areas that I've been talking about, and providing resources for habitat conservation planning through that integration. For human community benefits and resilience, we'll be developing planning data and tools to support local and regional planning and implementation for some of the things that I've already mentioned: regional transportation plans, sustainable community strategies, and general plan updates, hazard mitigation and disaster planning, particularly things like fire, landslides, floods, climate adaptation and action plans, regardless of where you are in the process, from folks just starting out to those who already have approved climate action plans. And then finally, identifying challenges to disadvantaged communities from climate change to make sure that we have some planning and efforts that focus on making those communities more resilient as well, in particular in rural wildland urban interface areas. Again, you may want to pause here and fill out the feedback form. So through all this work, we have a number of project outputs that we plan on developing, and I'm going to introduce you to those, and then we'll be asking for some feedback on those as well. So as I mentioned, we have, and I went through each of the focal areas, we have a bunch of different types of information and data that we think will develop for each topic area. And so we wanted to go through how we think we'll actually be developing the data to deliver to you for use. So first will be, most of this is based on mapping and the landscape. And so developing geospatial data layers is sort of a first level of information that we can provide. That might be data on things like ecosystem and human community vulnerability to wildfire, regional metrics of water quality and quantity, post-fire hydrologic metrics, land use and community demographic data, locations for conservation through acquisition or habitat restoration, targets to advance mitigation planning for development and infrastructure planning, or mapping of areas for climate smart growth for communities and transportation networks. We didn't really talk about either of the last two, but that may be a way where some of the integrated data that we're developing could be used to advance planning, in particular in some of the more urban areas downstream and adjacent to our rural communities. Now, in addition to the individual geospatial data layers, one of the things that we want to do is integrate some of that information into a data visualization and decision support tool that can really be modified by the user as appropriate. So to give you an example, I understand that thinking about what a decision support tool can really depend on how you might use it and how it's designed. And so wanted to give you a flavor for what we're thinking of. And the example that we'd like to show you as something that might be along the lines of what we're thinking we'd develop is the Smart Growth Equity Calculator. This has been developed by our colleague in the Department of City Planning here at SDSU, Bruce Appleyard. Now, this particular decision support tool is really focused on urban areas, as you can see, with lots of information in downtown San Diego and more urban areas. Now, if we were to develop something under the Connected Wildlands and Communities project, it would incorporate information in rural areas, in our natural areas, and use a suite of different metrics. So you can see some of the metrics incorporated into this existing tool are things like vehicle miles traveled, housing affordability on the right-hand side. And for whatever's been selected, you can have values ranging from good and green to poor and red. You can select the metric that you want to view. You can perhaps toggle the importance of different metrics. So you can look at different outcomes, different prioritizations based on the variables that are most important to you. And over time, we'll be asking you what type of information you might want to see in a tool like this, or whether there's already tools that you use where you would want to see this additional information integrated. And I understand maybe hard to sort of envision until we develop some of these data products, but just wanted to give you a sense for what we were thinking, where you can think about the variables that are most important to you and toggle those, but also perhaps be able to zoom into areas of critical importance that you're most interested in take a look at those and see what the variables are for a given area. So sort of coming at it from both perspectives. And in addition to developing a tool, we'd provide workshops that would show examples of how to use these, have folks put it to use and see how well it works, provide some tweaks and maybe some case studies of using this in planning and implementation, as well as some user trainings to really help folks get a sense for how this could be used and what you might want to do with it. Throughout the project, we'll be hosting some webinars, and the main focus of that will really be keeping you up to date on our research project progress and outputs, so you get a sense for what we're doing. In particular, if you're interested in one of our focal areas more so than the others, you may want to join in on that webinar. If you want to know more about the details of our modeling and the science behind some of our analyses, that would be a good opportunity to join. We'll be providing some case studies as we go along, putting this information to use and how well that can be done, examples of where there are successes and failures that we can learn from. One of the, I think, opportunities for this project is really to help create a community of practice that already exists to some extent, but continuing to build it. In particular, if people are using the same types of data and information, we think that that can really help. Planning for climate resilience and adaptation is something many of us are being tasked with as time goes on, and it can be a challenging process to step into. And hopefully by helping provide data and information, but also that community of practice, we can not only provide the science and support of the planning and decision making, but the opportunity to learn from one another as you go through the process. And then finally, depending on some of how the tools are used and the data that's available, perhaps developing some stakeholder-driven planning recommendations based on balancing some of the metrics, depending on the different topics that you're interested in or the focus that you have, perhaps from a conserved lands standpoint or from a human community planning standpoint. So this will be the final opportunity for feedback. So when you go visit your feedback form, we'll have, we're looking for 2 pieces of information on these project outputs. One is, based on the list that you see before you, which of these do you think would be most useful in the type of work that you do, that you would use the most or sound like it would integrate best into the way that you do your work? And then second, we're also interested in hearing from you. This is certainly not an all-inclusive list. This is just what we've come up with as a first crack. And we'd really like to hear from you what's not on this list that you think would be important, work well into your workflows. As I mentioned previously, maybe there's a tool you already use. We want to know about that. I think one of the main goals is that we're helping make climate adaptation and resilience planning something that's part of the work that you already do, rather than something that has to be completely separate. By integrating it and helping to make it as seamless as possible, the hope is that it becomes easier, more mainstream, and something that doesn't have to be entirely separate, so that it becomes integrated into our daily lives and hopefully more effective for being implemented. So with that, thank you for joining me. I look forward to reading about your feedback. We'll be providing some input based on the feedback that we got from you over time. And we appreciate your interest in the project and look forward to connecting with you about the Connecting Wildlands and Communities project in the future.